The hum of machinery aboard the freighter Aurora was the only sound keeping Luke Hanlon company as he worked on a malfunctioning energy converter. He wiped a smear of grease off his forehead, squinting at the frayed wires. It had been another long day, and nothing about the ship's constant need for repairs was helping his already sour mood. Working in the outer rim of the galaxy wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept him far away from the complex politics of the Galactic Council. "Luke, come in," a voice crackled through his headset. It was Captain Marlowe, a gruff, no-nonsense woman who had run the Aurora for over a decade. "We just received a transmission. It's personal, addressed directly to you." Luke frowned and set down his tools. Personal communications weren't common for someone like him, especially not out here on the frontier. His life was simple, solitary. His parents had died in a mining accident years ago, and he had no siblings, no close friends who would send him a message, let alone a transmission that seemed urgent. "Got it, Cap, I'll check it out." As he walked toward the ship's modest communication terminal, Luke's mind raced with possibilities. It could be a mistake, a misaddressed message, or worse, it could be bad news. But what could be worse than what he had already lived through? His life was a series of unremarkable events, held together by his skill in fixing things and staying out of trouble. The terminal blinked with a single message, marked as urgent. The sender was unknown, but the Galactic Council's emblem was stamped on the file. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. "Luke Hanlon," the message began. "This is an official notification from the Galactic Council's legal division. You have been named the sole beneficiary of the estate of Valarax Corlin of the Thrasy Alliance. Please report to the nearest legal authority for the reading of your inheritance." Luke stared at the screen, dumbfounded. Thrasy Alliance, Valarax Corlin? The names meant nothing to him. He'd never heard of this person, let alone had any dealings with anyone from the Thrasy, a warrior species known for their strict honor codes and complicated political hierarchies. How could he possibly be connected to one of their estates? Captain Marlowe's voice came back over the intercom, her tone dry. "Hope you're not planning on quitting, Hanlon. We can't afford to lose our best mechanic." "I've got no idea what this is," Luke replied, still staring at the screen. "Some kind of inheritance notice. They want me to go planetside and check it out." "Well," Marlowe grunted, "we're docking at Antares 7 soon. You've got time to figure it out. Just don't get too distracted. That generator's not going to fix itself." Luke smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." Antares 7 wasn't much to look at. It was a mining outpost on the edge of known space, where the dust of nearby asteroid belts coated everything in a reddish hue. Luke didn't spend much time planetside when they docked, preferring the quiet solitude of the ship. But today he had little choice. The Council's local office was nestled between a row of industrial warehouses. It was a nondescript building, with plain metal walls and a small Galactic Council flag flapping lazily in the dry wind. Inside, the air was cool, and a bored-looking clerk at the desk barely glanced up when Luke entered. "I'm here about an inheritance," Luke said awkwardly, not entirely sure how to phrase his situation. The clerk tapped a few buttons on their console. "Name?" "Luke Hanlon." The clerk's eyes scanned the screen in front of them before they raised an eyebrow. "Ah, yes, the Thrasy case. You're quite lucky. This is highly unusual for a human." "Lucky?" Luke muttered under his breath. "I don't even know what this is about." "Well, you'll find out soon enough. Follow me." The clerk led him down a series of hallways to a small conference room where another individual waited, an older man in a sharp blue council uniform. His face was lined with years of experience, and his eyes were as sharp as they were tired. "Mr. Hanlon," the man greeted, extending a hand. "I'm Representative Morcar. I've been assigned to handle the transfer of Valarax Corlin's estate to you." Luke shook his hand, still confused. "Look, I don't know what's going on. I don't know this Valarax person, and I'm not sure why I'm involved in any of this." Morcar gave him a sympathetic smile. "I understand your confusion, but I assure you, the Thrasy are a people of strict adherence to law and tradition. If you've been named in their will, it's not a mistake." Luke sat down as the representative tapped a few buttons on his tablet. A holographic image of a Thrasy male appeared, a tall, imposing figure with dark, patterned skin and glowing amber eyes. His expression was serious, almost somber, as he looked directly at Luke through the projection. "My name is Valarax Corlin," the hologram began, its voice deep and commanding. "If you are seeing this, it means I have passed from this life into the next, and my estate is now in your care." Luke shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This felt surreal. "I am bound by thrasy law to pass on my estate to one who has shown honor, strength, and respect. Though we have never met, Luke Hanlon, your deeds have reached my ears through trusted channels. You saved the life of my brother on Atheon IV when you repaired his ship under fire, and for that you are honored." Luke blinked in surprise. He remembered that day. It had been a frantic, desperate repair job on a small transport that had been caught in a pirate raid. He hadn't known the pilot's name, only that they were in danger, and fixing the ship had been his instinct. He never imagined it would lead to something like this. "By thrasy law," Valarax continued, "I bequeath to you my most cherished possession, my wives." Luke's brain ground to a halt. "Excuse me? My wives, Syra and Irel, are now yours to care for and protect as you see fit. They are strong and capable, and they will serve you well. Treat them with respect, and they will honor you in return." The hologram faded, leaving a stunned silence in the room. Luke opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "2 wives, what?" Morcar cleared his throat. "As you can see, Mr. Hanlon, this is a unique situation. Thrasy customs are complicated. Valarax was a man of great importance, and his wives are bound by his will to serve the one he deemed worthy." Luke stood up, pacing. "This is insane. I don't even know these women. I'm not looking to inherit 2 alien wives." "I understand this is overwhelming," Morcar said calmly, "but it is legally binding. The Thrasy take such matters seriously, and to refuse could be seen as a grave insult." Luke ran a hand through his hair. "This has to be some kind of mistake. I assure you it's not. Valarax's will was clear. Sarah and Irel will arrive tomorrow to formally begin their service to you." Luke's mind reeled. How could he possibly deal with this? 2 alien wives thrust into his life without warning. Because of a single act of kindness he had nearly forgotten. He had no idea what he was getting himself into. Chapter 2. The arrival. Luke barely slept that night. The idea of inheriting 2 alien wives wasn't something he could wrap his mind around, no matter how many times he tried. Thrasy customs or not, this felt absurd. Even in the strange and unpredictable world of galactic politics, the weight of what Valarax had left him was too heavy to simply ignore. But he had no idea how to handle it. When morning arrived, he found himself staring at the port window of the Aurora, nervously watching the streams of ships coming and going at Antares 7. Somewhere among them were Sira and Irel, the alien women now bound to him through a will he had no intention of being part of. "Relax, Hanlon," he muttered to himself. "It can't be that bad." A soft chime alerted him to a visitor at the docking bay. Luke swallowed hard and made his way to the airlock. As the doors hissed open, 2 tall figures stepped inside. Both women were unmistakably Thrasy. Sira, the taller of the 2, had striking green skin, adorned with intricate patterns of silver across her arms and neck, traditional markings of her clan, if Luke recalled correctly from the brief research he'd done. Her eyes, glowing with a soft amber light, were sharp and analytical, as if she was sizing up her new master with every glance. Irel, shorter but no less intimidating, had dark violet skin, with long white hair cascading down her back. She looked younger, but there was an intensity to her gaze, a quiet fierceness that made Luke instinctively step back. Both women were dressed in formal Thrasy garments, a blend of armor and fabric that signified their status as wives of a warrior, though the fact that they were now standing before Luke, a simple mechanic, felt entirely out of place. For a moment, the 3 of them stood in awkward silence, Luke searching for something, anything, to say. "Hi," he finally stammered, feeling utterly ridiculous. "I'm Luke." Sira's eyes narrowed slightly and she gave a curt nod. "We know who you are. Our late husband's will has made it clear. I am Sira Corlin, first wife of Valarax. This is Irel, his second wife." Irel stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling curiosity. "So you are the human we are to serve. Fascinating." Luke winced at the word serve. He wasn't comfortable with the idea of anyone serving him, let alone 2 warrior wives from an alien culture he barely understood. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding, Luke said quickly. I didn't ask for this, and I'm not really looking for this kind of arrangement. I'm just a mechanic, okay? I don't have the resources or anything to deal with this. Sierra crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. We are bound by the will of our husband. To refuse would dishonor his memory. Irel tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. Are you frightened, human? Do you think we will devour you? Luke blinked, completely taken aback. What? No, good, she interrupted, her smile widening slightly. Because we do not intend to be a burden. We are capable and trained in many arts. You will find us useful. Syrah sighed, clearly more serious than her counterpart. We understand this situation is difficult, but we are thrasy, and our customs demand we honor our deceased husband's will. However, if you truly wish to release us from our service, there are ways. Luke's heart lifted slightly at the idea of not being trapped in this arrangement. What ways? We can petition the Thrasy Council to dissolve the bond, Syrah explained, but it would require us to show that you are unfit or unwilling to care for us according to Thrasy law. Such petitions can take months, even years, and until then, we are bound to you. Years, Luke's hope deflated. He wasn't about to get tangled up in Thrasy bureaucracy. He rubbed his temples, feeling the stress of the situation press down on him. Okay, let's just take this one step at a time. You said you're trained in various arts. What exactly does that mean? Syrah and Irel exchanged a glance before Irel spoke up. We are skilled in combat, strategy, diplomacy, and various forms of entertainment and household management. Our late husband was a high-ranking officer in the Thrasy military. We served as both companions and protectors. Companions and protectors? Luke repeated, still not entirely sure what that entailed. Irel's eyes sparkled with amusement. Indeed, we can fight as well as we can. Comfort. Luke's face flushed and he quickly waved his hands. Okay, I get it, no need to go into details. Syrah stepped forward, her expression softening slightly. We understand that this arrangement is uncomfortable for you, but we will honor our bond, Luke Hanlon. We ask only that you do the same. Luke looked between them, feeling a growing sense of responsibility. He couldn't just abandon these women, even if the whole situation was beyond bizarre. They were bound to him by their customs, and while he didn't agree with it, he couldn't disrespect the memory of Valorax or the sacrifices these women had made. All right, Luke said finally. We'll figure this out, but I'm not treating you like servants. If you're going to be part of my life for the time being, we do this as equals. Deal? Syrah raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his offer. Very well, she said after a pause. We will follow your lead. Irel chuckled softly. This will be an interesting arrangement indeed. The first few days were awkward, to say the least. Luke wasn't sure how to navigate living with two alien women who had been trained as warriors and diplomats, and the Aurora was hardly equipped to accommodate their presence. Syrah took charge of organizing the ship's small living quarters, while Irel found amusement in watching Luke work, her sharp eyes observing every tool he used. They didn't talk much at first, but slowly, the silence gave way to small conversations. Syrah was more reserved, only speaking when necessary, but Irel seemed fascinated by Luke's life as a mechanic, asking him about the different machines he repaired and the places he had traveled. You've lived such a simple life, Irel mused one day as she watched Luke repair a control panel. No grand battles, no political intrigue. How do you not grow bored? Luke shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. I like the simplicity. I've had enough chaos in my life. This job keeps me grounded. Irel leaned closer, her violet eyes shimmering. Perhaps you need a bit of chaos. It makes life more exciting. Luke chuckled nervously, not entirely sure how to respond. Irel had a way of getting under his skin, her constant teasing keeping him on edge. But despite the strange circumstances, he couldn't deny that having them around wasn't as bad as he'd feared. In fact, it was starting to feel normal. But just as Luke began to adjust to his new reality, a message from the Thrasy Council arrived, one that threatened to upend everything. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Challenge. The soft hum of the Aurora's engines was a soothing backdrop as Luke made his way to the cockpit, a routine now familiar, despite the presence of Syrah and Irel in his daily life. Over the past few days, they had begun to settle in. Sira's quiet competence helped keep the ship running more efficiently, while Irel's constant curiosity kept Luke entertained, even if her teasing left him flustered more often than not. But just as things were starting to feel normal, a ping from the ship's communication console interrupted the morning calm. "Luke Hanlon," Sira's calm voice came from the doorway, startling him. "A message from the Thrasy Council has arrived. It bears the insignia of High Command." Luke froze for a moment, his heart rate spiking. He hadn't expected to hear from the Council this soon, and the fact that it came with a High Command insignia meant it wasn't just a formal check-in. Something significant was happening. "Let's see it," Luke muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He tapped the console, and a holographic image flickered to life, a tall Thrasy warrior draped in ceremonial armor, with the unmistakable crest of a high-ranking official across his chest. His amber eyes glowed with authority, and his stern expression left no room for pleasantries. "Luke Hanlon," the warrior said, his voice deep and commanding. "I am General Corteth of the Thrasy High Command. You have been entrusted with the care of Valarax Corlin's estate, including his wives. However, there are elements within the Thrasy nobility who question the validity of this inheritance." Luke blinked in surprise. "Question the validity? What do you mean?" The general's eyes narrowed. "Valarax's family is powerful and influential. While his will is legally binding, there are those who believe that his choice of a human, an outsider, to care for his wives dishonors his legacy. They demand a challenge." Luke swallowed hard. A challenge? He had heard of Thrasy challenges before, ritual combat or tests of skill meant to prove one's worth, and he already knew he had no place in a Thrasy duel, no matter how confident he was in his ability to solve mechanical problems. Combat wasn't his strength. "Wait," Luke interrupted, raising his hands in protest. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't want this inheritance, and I'm not exactly qualified to fight in some kind of alien trial." The general's expression remained stony. "You are bound by Thrasy law just as we are. Refusal to accept the challenge would be seen as cowardice, and the women would be returned to Valarax's family. If you wish to keep them under your care, you must prove your worth." Sira, who had been standing silently beside Luke, finally spoke up. "General Corteth, I am first wife to Valarax. Is there no other way to settle this dispute? Luke is a mechanic, not a warrior. The challenge would be unjust." The general regarded her with respect but shook his head. "I am afraid not, Sira. The challenge has already been issued. You and Irel know the stakes. If Luke fails, you will be returned to the Corlin family, and they will decide your fates." Irel, who had been lounging near the cockpit, now stood up, her eyes blazing with determination. "Then we will fight for him," she declared, her voice full of defiance. "We are warriors, bound to protect our husband's honor. Luke has shown us respect and kindness. He should not be forced to fight a battle that isn't his." Corteth looked at Irel with a mixture of admiration and disapproval. "Irel, you may be a warrior, but this challenge must be met by the one named in the will. That is the law." Luke's mind raced. There was no way out of this. The Thrasy law was absolute, and even if Sira and Irel were willing to fight on his behalf, it wouldn't be allowed. He was stuck. And to make matters worse, he had no idea what the challenge would even entail. "How long do I have?" Luke asked quietly. 3 days, Corteth replied. "The challenge will take place on Thras Prime in the Royal Arena. You will be given time to prepare, but know that the challenge is not to the death. It is merely a test of your strength and honor. However, if you fail, you lose the right to Valarax's estate." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Luke standing in stunned silence. 3 days. 3 days to figure out how to survive a Thrasy challenge, and prove that he could somehow live up to the expectations of a warrior culture he barely understood. For the next few hours, Luke barely spoke. He sat in the ship's mess hall, staring at the table in front of him, trying to figure out how he was going to get through this. Sira and Irel sat across from him, both silent but watching him closely. "I'm not a fighter," Luke said finally, breaking the silence. "I don't know the first thing about Thrasy challenges. This is a disaster. We will help you," Sira said firmly. "Valarax's honor rests on this. You must succeed." Irel smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, we'll train you, all right. You're about to become a warrior, whether you like it or not. Luke let out a frustrated sigh. I don't have time to become a warrior. I have 3 days. What am I supposed to do? Learn how to use a sword? Fight hand to hand? Sira's eyes softened. The challenge won't be purely physical. It's a test of your character, your ability to think, and your will to protect us. The thrasy value strategy as much as they value combat. Luke looked at her, feeling a glimmer of hope. So you're saying I don't have to win a fight? You may not have to, Sira replied, but you will need to hold your ground. Thrasy challenges are designed to push you to your limits. If you can prove yourself worthy in any of the tests, you'll pass. Iril grinned. That's where we come in. We'll train you. You don't need to become a master fighter in 3 days, but we'll teach you enough to survive. Luke wasn't sure if he was reassured by that or terrified. The next 3 days were a blur of intense training. Sira focused on teaching Luke how to think strategically, showing him the importance of reading his opponent and using his surroundings to his advantage. Iril, on the other hand, was all about combat. She taught him basic hand-to-hand techniques, pushing him hard enough that he collapsed in exhaustion each night. Luke's body ached in places he didn't even know existed, but he kept going. There was too much at stake. He couldn't let Sira and Iril be forced back into Valarax's family, where their fates would be decided by people who saw them as property. And despite his reluctance to accept this inheritance, he had grown fond of the 2 women. They had come to mean more to him than just an obligation. On the 3rd day, the Aurora arrived at Thras Prime. The planet's capital was a grand, sprawling city of towering spires and ancient arenas. The Royal Arena, where the challenge would take place, loomed in the distance like a monument to centuries of thrasy tradition. As Luke stepped out onto the platform, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The arena was packed with thrasy nobles, all watching with keen interest. At the center of the arena stood the challenge master, a tall, imposing figure draped in ceremonial armor, with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through Luke's very soul. Sira and Iril stood behind him, their expressions stoic, but Luke could see the concern in their eyes. The challenge master raised his arm, and the crowd fell silent. Luke Hanlon, human and inheritor of Valarax Corlin's estate, you stand before the Thrasy Council to prove your worth. Are you ready to face the challenge? Luke's heart pounded in his chest, but he squared his shoulders and nodded. I'm ready. The challenge master's eyes gleamed. Very well, let the challenge begin. Chapter 4. The final test. The arena's silence was eerie, broken only by the soft wind blowing across the towering walls of the Colosseum. Luke stood at the center of the grand Thrasy arena, heart pounding, hands clammy with sweat. He had never been more out of place. Around him, the crowd of Thrasy nobles waited in anticipation, their glowing eyes locked on the lone human about to take on one of their most sacred traditions. Sira and Iril stood off to the side, their expressions a mixture of concern and resolve. They had spent the last 3 days pushing him to his limits, preparing him as best they could, but none of them knew what the challenge would truly entail. All they knew was that failure meant they would be taken away from him, returned to the cold control of Valarax's powerful family. The challenge master, towering and stern, raised his hand. His deep voice echoed through the arena. Luke Hanlon, you will face 3 trials today. Each will test a different aspect of your worthiness. The first trial will measure your strength. Luke swallowed hard. Strength, not exactly his strong suit. He wasn't weak, but compared to a Thrasy, a race known for their physical prowess, he was going to be at a severe disadvantage. From one of the arena gates, 2 Thrasy guards emerged, carrying a massive stone pillar between them. The pillar was about twice Luke's height and covered in intricate carvings. They set it down in front of him with a loud thud. You will lift this pillar and carry it across the arena to the other side, the challenge master announced. This is a test of both your physical strength and your determination. Succeed, and you may continue to the next trial. Fail, and the challenge ends here. Luke stared at the pillar, his stomach twisting. It looked impossibly heavy. The Thrasy guards who had carried it barely broke a sweat, but Luke could already feel his muscles protesting just from looking at it. He stepped forward and gripped the base of the pillar, bracing himself for what was sure to be a humiliating struggle. As he heaved, the pillar barely moved. He gritted his teeth and tried again, putting every ounce of strength he had into lifting it. Nothing, the crowd murmured in disappointment, and Luke felt his face flush with embarrassment. He had barely started, and already he was failing. He glanced over at Sierra and Irel, who stood watching with intensity. They said nothing, but the look in their eyes pushed him forward. Luke closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He wasn't a thrasy warrior, but he didn't need to be. He had survived worse odds in his life. If there was one thing he had learned from his years working as a mechanic, it was that brute force wasn't always the answer. Sometimes it was about leverage. He crouched lower, adjusting his grip on the pillar, and this time, instead of trying to lift it straight up, he used the momentum of his body weight to tilt the pillar forward. It wasn't much, but it moved. With a grunt, he leaned into it, slowly tipping it onto its side. The crowd's murmurs turned into surprised whispers as Luke began to roll the pillar across the arena. It wasn't the intended way to move it, but he was moving it nonetheless. Inch by inch he pushed, using his legs and his entire body to keep the momentum going. His muscles screamed in protest and sweat poured down his face, but he kept going. After what felt like an eternity, the pillar reached the other side of the arena. Luke collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his arms trembling from the exertion. The challenge master nodded approvingly. "You have shown resourcefulness in the face of overwhelming odds. You may proceed to the second trial." Luke staggered to his feet, feeling both relief and dread. If the first trial had been a test of strength, what would the next one be? The second trial came almost immediately. A massive gate at the far end of the arena creaked open, and out stepped a thrasy warrior clad in full ceremonial armor, his body rippling with muscle. In his hand was a long, ornate spear, and his glowing eyes locked onto Luke with a predatory intensity. The challenge master's voice boomed again. "The second trial is combat. You must face thrasy warrior Calvor in single combat. The fight is not to the death. You need only disarm him or render him unable to continue." Luke's heart sank. This was the one trial he had feared the most. Combat wasn't something he had any experience in. Sure, Irel had trained him for a few days, but a few days wasn't nearly enough to stand up against a seasoned thrasy warrior. Calvor stepped forward, his spear spinning effortlessly in his hands. He was taller than Luke by at least a foot and built like a tank. Luke felt like a child standing before a giant. The warrior lunged, and Luke barely had time to react. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the tip of the spear as it whistled through the air where his head had been moments before. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, trying to remember what Irel had taught him. "Use your speed," Irel had said. "You're not going to overpower a thrasy, but you can outthink them. Use their strength against them." Luke circled around Calvor, trying to stay out of range of the spear, but the warrior was fast, faster than he had expected. Another thrust came and Luke ducked, but this time the spear grazed his arm, drawing a thin line of blood. The crowd roared in approval. Luke grit his teeth, feeling the sting of the wound. He couldn't keep running. He had to find a way to disarm Calvor, but how? The spear was too long, and the warrior too skilled. Then an idea struck him. Luke backed away, giving Calvor enough space to think he was on the run again. The warrior advanced, readying his spear for another strike. Just as Calvor lunged forward, Luke sidestepped at the last possible second, grabbing the shaft of the spear with both hands. Using the warrior's momentum against him, Luke yanked the spear downward with all his strength, sending Calvor stumbling forward. In the same motion, Luke twisted the spear out of the warrior's hands and tossed it aside. The crowd gasped in shock as Calvor fell to his knees, momentarily stunned by the loss of his weapon. Luke didn't give him time to recover. He grabbed the spear and held it to Calvor's throat, his chest heaving from the exertion. The challenge master's voice rang out again. "Calvor is disarmed. The second trial is complete." Luke stepped back, letting the spear drop to the ground as Calvor stood up, nodding in respect before leaving the arena. Luke couldn't believe it. He had actually won. Somehow he had managed to survive 2 of the 3 trials, but the hardest trial was yet to come. The third trial was unlike anything Luke had expected. The challenge master led him to a secluded part of the arena, where a small platform stood surrounded by a complex network of glowing symbols. At the center of the platform was an ancient thrasy artifact, a small, intricately carved stone orb that seemed to pulse with energy. The third trial, the challenge master explained, is one of wisdom. This artifact is a test of your mind. It will present you with a puzzle, one that requires both intellect and intuition to solve. You will have 1 hour to complete it. Fail, and the challenge will be lost. Luke stepped onto the platform, his heart pounding. A puzzle, that wasn't what he had expected. But then again, this was a test of his worthiness, and the thrasy valued more than just brute strength. As he approached the orb, it began to glow brighter, and a series of symbols appeared in the air around him. The puzzle seemed to be a combination of logic and pattern recognition, but the symbols were unlike anything he had ever seen. He had no idea where to begin. Minutes passed, and Luke's frustration grew. He couldn't make sense of the symbols, and time was running out. He closed his eyes, trying to focus. There had to be a pattern, something he was missing. Then something Irel had said echoed in his mind. Sometimes it's not about solving the problem. It's about understanding it. Luke opened his eyes and looked at the puzzle again, this time not trying to force a solution. He let his mind relax, allowing the symbols to flow in front of him without trying to analyze them. Slowly the pattern began to emerge, hidden connections between the symbols that he hadn't noticed before. With renewed focus, Luke started arranging the symbols in the correct order. It was like solving a mechanical problem. Each piece had its place, and once he found it, everything clicked into place. As the final symbol locked in, the orb pulsed with a brilliant light, and the platform glowed with approval. The third trial is complete, the challenge master announced. Luke Hanlon has passed all 3 trials. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Luke stood there in stunned disbelief. He had done it. He had passed the thrasy challenge. Sira and Irel rushed to his side, their faces full of pride and relief. "You did it," Sira said quietly, her voice filled with admiration. Irel grinned and punched him lightly on the arm. "Not bad for a human." Luke smiled, exhausted but victorious. He had proven himself worthy not just to the thrasy but to Sira and Irel as well. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. Epilogue. A few days later, Luke, Sira, and Irel stood aboard the Aurora, watching the stars streak past as they left Thras Prime behind. The challenge was over, but their journey together had just begun. Sira stood beside Luke, her expression thoughtful. "You could have walked away," she said quietly. "You didn't have to fight for us." Luke glanced at her, then at Irel, who was lounging in the corner with a satisfied grin on her face. "I couldn't leave you two behind," he said simply. "We're in this together now." Irel chuckled. "Well, we did say we'd serve you, didn't we? Now it seems we'll be the ones following your lead." Luke smiled, feeling a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but for the first time he wasn't facing them alone. As the stars stretched out before them, the Aurora sailed on, carrying its strange and unexpected family into the unknown.